Afternoon, folks. Welcome back to the Food for the Faithful channel with me, Bill Reimer. Again, always reluctant to be a prophet. You know, the thing that amazes me? There's nothing special about me. I don't ask anyone to believe what I have to say. But I can do research, and everything that I have to share with you is public information. There's no reason that everyone shouldn't know what I'm about to share. It really, really frightens me that people are so willing, so ready just to roll over and give up rather than to think for themselves. It's the only thing that makes us different from the animals, that we're capable of thought and self-awareness and self-reflection. So I'm going to start with a few of my own thoughts regarding Mark Carney and my preamble. So today I will read from two articles which describe in lurid detail why Mark Carney will be an unmitigated disaster for Canadians after I share a few personal thoughts on our present situation. He represents the most insidious version of a regulatory, all-controlling nanny state that intends to monitor your thoughts, movements, and economic transactions. Most Canadians are ill-prepared for what Carney's reign of illiberal socio-economic control portends for us. I am a free enterprise, free market, economy absolutist, knowing full well that those who want economic control do not produce themselves, create no value, and confiscate our wealth in the name of redistribution, to distribute our assets right into their own coffers. The entire purpose of a functional democracy is to have maximum local representation. Again, the entire purpose of a functional democracy is to have maximum local representation. So Mark Carney's globalist premiership spells the provably diametric opposite to that. So first I will address my conservative and libertarian friends. Here's what those of you who claim to loathe the globalist LPC-NDP coalition fail to understand. You falsely assume that they must be stupid, but they're not. Globalist socialism does not exist because of stupidity. Rather, it exists because of the sin of pride, one of the 7 deadly sins that I spoke in depth about in my previous blog and vodcast. In fact, it was created by brilliant people driven by the will to power. Nietzsche's great prediction written in his posthumous book, The Will to Power, is all that drives mankind, according to these neo-totalitarians. Therefore, you fail to understand them. You fail to understand what drives them. They believe themselves to be so enlightened that they have the right to exercise total control over us. They also believe that we are nothing but under-evolved troglodytes who must be lorded over by them due to our inherent unenlightened ignorance. This is precisely how the Nazis viewed the Jews. As a result, conservatives have become postmodern Jews in this emerging Marxo-fascist system where investment bankers have found the means by which they can abscond our assets while persecuting us for standing up for economic freedom. This globalist cabal are Malthusian anti-humanists who seek to run the world in the name of saving the planet by culling Mother Gaia of humanity itself. But if you're looking for stupid, look no further than the idiots who support their own ruin out of suicidal empathy for the leaders of this Gnostic mystery cult, this anti-Christian cabal. If I have learned one lesson, it is that playing nice with socialists leads to an endless attempt to reason with those who have but one agenda, namely to take the long march through the institutions to poison them from within. So my gloves are off. Well, they've always been off, ever since I began to fully realize what this is. Now, to my socialistically minded friends, I have but one fear: that I will fail to successfully warn you about how insidious leftist goals are and how truly maniacal the leaders chosen not by you, but by the elite themselves truly are. I seriously wonder why the proletariat never asks how their socialist leaders became so obscenely wealthy. Since the socialist elite subscribe to an economic model based on redistribution rather than production, they've managed to redistribute the income of the proletariat into their own pockets. Are you foolish enough not to realize the fact that your socialist leaders are the new parasitical bourgeoisie who lack all the virtue of the old, since the old bourgeoisie actually produced stuff while employing you? That's the end of my thoughts. I'm going to start reading some articles, two articles. First is Canada's Failing Government and Failing Media in a New Age of Geopolitics by Tom Quiggin. Again, I'm reading directly from both these articles. In Canada, the media and politicians have shown a remarkable lack of knowledge surrounding our current geopolitical and economic situation. It appears to be a case of willful ignorance. The biggest upheaval in global politics, which has been building up for a decade or more, is now happening at breakneck speed. Canada is ill-prepared and will be ground to powder. Trump. What is Trump about? And how does Canada fit into this situation? It matters, as the U.S. economy is 10 times the size of that of Canada. They have a military and a border force. We do not. Like it or not, they have an emerging plan for a new direction. Canada, on the other hand, remains dedicated to crushing itself to please Europe and Chinese globalists. Trump and China. Trump's key area of policy interest is China. He correctly believes that China's pursuit of unrestricted warfare, China's own term, over the past 20 years or more has been successful. America has been deindustrialized. The Belt and Road Initiative has successfully moved into Asia, Eurasia, South America, and North America. Brazil has a pro-China socialist government, etc., etc., etc. China wants influence in the Arctic and has already put Chinese mining companies into Greenland. Seng Resources, Kvanefjeld Project, and General Nice and the Isua Project are but two examples. Fentanyl, organized crime, espionage, commercial investments, and real estate investments have been a major part of this activity. Trump and fentanyl. Let's try to shut this off. I don't know how it keeps dinging. Sorry. Don't disturb. I don't like being disturbed. Trump and fentanyl. Since 2018, more than 250,000 Americans have died of fentanyl overdoses. Far greater than the Vietnam War, where 58,000 were dead. This does not include opiates, just fentanyl. The fentanyl crisis is driven almost entirely by China and Mexican cartels. Canadians are heavily implicated in this, such as TD Bank doing organized money laundering for fentanyl profits of Mexican cartels. D-Bank and Big Five Canadian Bank helped kill 250,000 Americans. This is not a good plan for Canada. TD Bank was run by a Ugandan, and the Canadian government has done nothing to go after TD Bank or the others for their role in killing Americans. Total state of denial on the part of Trudeau and Ford. Interestingly enough, a conservative estimate based on Public Health Canada data suggests that between 35,000 and 40,000 Canadians have died from fentanyl-involved overdoses since 2016. Canadian military deaths in World War II were around 45,000. Trump and Canada. Trump sees Canada, correctly, as having been thoroughly infiltrated by China. He sees Canada as part of the problem and not a part of the solution. Remember that even the Canadian Parliament has admitted there are a dozen or more MPs and senators who have been compromised by China. Look at Vancouver or Toronto real estate. Read Sam Cooper's book on China's infiltration, Willful Blindness, how a network of narcos, tycoons, and Chinese Communist Party agents infiltrated the rest. Canada is also seen as having been grossly infiltrated by Iranians, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Khalistanis. The northern border of the USA is now often seen as a national security threat rather than the world's longest undefended border. Trump and Europe, NATO, and Ukraine. Trump wants to clear the decks before making the big push against China. This means figuring out what to do with NATO, Ukraine, and by extension, what to do with Europe. Trump has consistently argued since 2016 that the USA will no longer pay the lion's shares of NATO spending in Europe. He has consistently stated that Ukraine is a European problem and Europe needs to fix it. He will find a way to do one of two things: either get the war stopped or turn it into a European problem only. Trump and Russia and China, as stated above. Trump's biggest interest is China. Under Biden, the unthinkable occurred when Russia and China became clearly aligned with each other. Preventing this has been a cornerstone project of American diplomacy since the end of the Second World War. Trump will find a way to drive a wedge between China and Russia. It is in the interest of both America and Europe that this occurs. This means, for one thing, getting the war in Ukraine stopped and off the table. Canada is failing. Next subtitle. Like it or not, Canada is now at the center of a global geopolitical struggle between the USA and China, with Russia and Europe in play on the sidelines. The Arctic is a key battleground. Energy is a key battleground. Strategic minerals and rare earth minerals are a battleground. Trade and manufacturing are now seen as tools of the struggle. Canada's natural resources and geographic location place us in a brilliant position to help ourselves and to help Europe and the USA. Instead, we have madly maintained anti-energy and anti-mining policies aimed at saving the world while impoverishing Canada. Canada has a strong anti-energy policy. While multiple countries have addressed us wanting to buy energy we refuse to develop. Canada's politicians seem to feel insulting Americans is a policy option while refusing to even acknowledge a changing world around us. Canada now has virtually no ability to protect its own sovereignty in the north. Trump will not stand by while Russia and China move further into the Arctic while Canada does nothing. Trudeau, Carney, Ford, Freeland. The politics of division has been the hallmark of Trudeau and his nationalist policy orientation. He has been blindly followed by others such as Freeland and Ford. Former Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister Freeland recently suggested that Canada should form an alliance with France and the UK so as to be in a position to threaten America with nuclear weapons. How stunningly stupid would you need to be to even make such an assertion? Having closely followed political and security affairs for over 40 years, this might be the most stupid and dangerous statement ever made by a Canadian. threatening America with a nuclear attack while standing in Canada is a complex form of suicide. Presumably, U.S. national security officials will see this as the mindless ranting of a clueless ex-political figure. Yet Freeland may yet play a role in the next Liberal government of Carney. Without going into details, Ford is equally clueless. A former hashish dealer for 7 years with a violent family past, he still sees the world through the lens of a jumped-up corner boy. But he is now in the big leagues and shows no awareness of the powers he is challenging. Ontario and Canada will get hurt. As for Carney, he is Trudeau 2.0, but arguably worse. Canada and the USA. The options for Canada to re-emerge into something which could be prosperous and beneficial exist. Unfortunately, no one in Canada from any party seems to be aware we are caught up in the wheels of a massive meat grinder. The media in Canada are of little help. Paid by the government and driven by advocacy journalism, the vast majority of our social justice journalists do not even have the intelligence to ask the right questions anymore. They are clueless, a few exceptions. We're in trouble. But don't worry. The Canadian forces have tampons in the men's washroom, and we ban plastic straws. That will fix stuff. So that's the end of that article. The next one's from National Post by Peter Foster. Mark Carney, man of destiny, arises to revolutionize society, and it won't be pleasant. From the archives, what Carney ultimately wants is a technocratic dictatorship justified by climate alarmism. Again, the author is Peter Foster, originally published on June the 5th, 2021. It was last updated on January the 16th of this year, 2025. Mark Carney has announced his candidacy for the Liberal Party leadership and Prime Minister. Originally published on the 5th of June 2021, this in-depth Peter Foster column provides a unique look into Carney's ideas, particularly as expressed in his book, Values, Building a Better World for All. In his book, Values, Building a Better World for All, Mark Carney, former governor both of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, claims that Western society is morally rotten and that it has been corrupted by capitalism. Not fascism, not communism, but by capitalism, by freedom. Remember, capitalism means free market, free enterprise, freedom, which has brought about a climate emergency that threatens life on Earth. This, he claims, requires rigid controls on personal freedom, industry, and corporate funding. Carney's views are important because he is a UN Special Envoy on climate action and finance. He is also advisor to both the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, remember this was written in the past, and the next big climate conference in Glasgow, and to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Since the advent of the COVID pandemic, Carney has been front and center in the promotion of a political agenda known as the Great Reset, or the Green New Deal, or Building Back Better. All are predicated on the claim that COVID and its disruption of the global economy provided a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not just to regulate climate, but to frame a more fair, more diverse, more inclusive, more safe, and more woke world. Of course, that doesn't account for the fact that our major cities are rife with violence and drug deaths and murder and gun crime. Carney draws inspiration from, among others, Marx, Engels, and Lenin. But the agenda he promotes differs from Marxism in two key respects. First, the private sector is not to be expropriated, but made a partner in reshaping the economy and society. Second, it does not make a promise to make the lives of ordinary people better, but worse. Carney's Brave New World will be one of severely constrained choice, less flying, less meat, more inconvenience, and more poverty. Assets will be stranded. Used gasoline powered cars will be unsaleable. Inefficient properties will be unrentable. He promises. The agenda's objectives are in fact already being enforced, not primarily by legislation, but the application of non-governmental, that is, non-democratic pressure on the corporate sector via the ever-expanding dictates of ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance, and by sustainable finance, which is designed to starve non-compliant companies of funds, thus rendering them, as Carney puts it, climate roadkill. What ESG actually represents is a corporate ideological compulsion. It is a key instrument of stakeholder capitalism. Carney's agenda is promoted by the United Nations and other international bureaucracies and a vast and ever-growing array of non-governmental organizations and fora, especially the World Economic Forum, where Carney is a trustee. Also, perhaps most surprisingly, by its corporate victims. No one wants to become climate roadkill. Carney clearly feels himself to be a man of destiny. When I worked at the Bank of England, he writes in Values, I would remind myself each morning of Marcus Aurelius's phrase, arise to do the work of humankind. One is reminded of French aristocrat and social reformer Henri de Saint-Simon, the grand seigneur sans culotte, who ordered his valet to wake him with similar words. Remember, Monsieur le Comte, that you have great things to do. These people's narcissism is limitless. It's unbelievable. That is not the only thing Carney has in common with Saint-Simon, who believed that society should be ruled by savants such as himself, an alliance of engineers and other technocratic intellectuals, along with bankers. Carney is very much a banker technocrat, not merely at ease gliding along the corridors of global bureaucratic power, but expert at framing arguments that support an ever-expanding role for his class. His expansive pretensions first appeared at the Bank of Canada. If the economy is like a game of ice hockey, then central bankers should ideally be like Zamboni drivers, whose job is to keep the ice flat. Carney had in fact been a goalie during his academic years at both Harvard and Oxford. At the Bank of Canada, he often seemed like the Zamboni driver who thought that he was Wayne Gretzky. He could never resist lecturing private businesses to stop sitting on dead money, or tell them that they were too timid in the international arena, or advising consumers that they were spending too little or borrowing too much. He promoted macroprudence, the idea that regulators, in their panoptic wisdom, would focus on the forest, not the trees. Now he wants to establish himself as an intellectual. Carney has a lot to put straight with the world. According to his new book and the related BBC Wreath lectures that Carney delivered last year, the three great crises of credit, 2008-9 version, COVID, and climate, are all rooted in a single problem. People in general, and markets in particular, are not wise, moral, or far-seeing as Carney. He sums up his failing as the tragedy of the horizon, a phrase he concocted for a speech ahead of the 2015 Paris Climate Conference. However, Carney is sophistic when it comes to the alleged moral shortcomings of capitalism. It has been one of the most tedious tropes of the left since at least the Communist Manifesto that the rise of commerce would drive out all that is virtuous in society, leaving nothing but the cash nexus of trade. One of Carney's favorite philosophers is Harvard's Michael Sandel, who produced endless trivial examples suggesting that we have moved from a market economy to a market society. Should sex be up for sale, Carney thunders, following Sandel? Should there be a market in the right to have children? Why not auction the right to opt out of military service? Why shouldn't universities sell admissions to raise money for worthy causes? But the very fact that people reflectively feel uneasily about it or outright reject such notion entirely disproves his point. People do not believe that everything is or should be for sale. Carney notes the long debate, going back to classical times, on the nature of commercial value. This was theoretically resolved by the marginalist revolution, which put paid to the paradox of value that puzzled over the usually low price of useful water and the usual high price of useless diamonds. The marginalist pointed out that commercial value isn't determined by usefulness or labor input. It is inevitably subjective, based on personal preferences and available resources. There's no paradox. Someone dying of thirst in the middle of a desert might be more than willing to offer a bucket of diamonds for a bucket of water. Mark Carney is a UN Special Envoy on Climate Action. Next subtitle. However, market valuations are essentially different from moral values. A distinction Carney continually muddles. He misrepresents the marginalist subjectivist perspective, claiming that it implies that anything not commercially priced is not considered valuable. Market value, he writes, is taken to represent intrinsic value, and if a good or activity is not on the market, it is not valued. But who holds such an idiotic view? Nobody prices their family, children, friends, and community spirit or the beauties of nature, although there is certainly lots of calculation going on in the background. Carney constantly berates market fundamentalism, straw men who employ standard economic reasoning and who believe that people are rational and markets perfect. He incorrectly claims that Adam Smith, in his first great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, said that a sense of morality was not inherent. In fact, Smith believes that we are born with such a sense, which is then fine-tuned by the society in which we grow up. However, Carney, like all leftists, leans toward the blank slate, nurture over nature perspective, because it suggests that human nature might be beneficially reformed under the right, that is, left, social arrangements. Carney believes our moral sentiments started going astray around the time of the publication of Smith's better-known work, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, when the Industrial Revolution was beginning to take off. He rightly suggests that one should read both books to gain a full appreciation of Smith's insights, but he seems to have missed the significance of Smith's put-down of whining and melancholy moralists, his cynicism about insidious and crafty politicians, and his thoroughgoing skepticism about those who would trade for public good, that is, the ESG crowd. Moreover, Smith noted that the greatest corrupter of moral sentiment was not karmas, but faction and fanaticism, that is, politics and religion, which come closer together in the new toxic stew of climate alarmism and ESG. ESG used to be called Corporate Social Responsibility, or CSR. The Nobel economist Milton Friedman warned against its subversive nature 50 years ago. He noted that taking on eternally dictated social responsibilities beyond those directly related to a company's business opened the floodgates to endless pressure and interference. The big question are responsibility to whom, and for what? Carney also typically misrepresents Friedman, suggesting that he claimed that stakeholders should rank über alles, and to the exclusion of other legitimate stakeholders such as employees and local communities. Carney claims that at times large positive gains could accrue to society if small sacrifices were made on behalf of shareholders. But by what right would management sacrifice shareholders, and who would decide which sacrifices should be made? Carney admits that the integrated reporting required by ESG is a morass, ESG rating considered hundreds of metrics, with many of them qualitative in nature. Putting values to work is a hard work, but as with virtue, it should become easy with sustained practice. No need to ask whose version of values and virtue is to prevail. Obviously, Carney's, in his mind. Despite his thorough castigation of market society, Carney somehow also believes this corroded society is clamoring to make great personal sacrifices for draconian climate actions and the UN Sustained Development Goals. Carney has been a prime pusher of net zero, that noted that climate-related human emissions must be entirely eradicated, buried, or offset by 2050 if the world is to avoid climate Armageddon. He claims that net zero is highly valued by society. In reality, the vast majority of people have no clue what it entails. When Carney talks about this version of society, he's talking about a small radical element of it. Carney peddles the non sequitur because the world wasn't ready for COVID. This confirms that the world is being short-sighted about climate catastrophe, but COVID is an obvious reality. An existential climate threat is a hypothesis, frequently promoted, admittedly with great success, by those with agendas. He claims a good introduction to this subject can be found in journalist David Wallace Wells' The Uninhabitable Earth, a work heavily criticized even by prominent climate change scientists for its factual errors and exaggerations. Indeed, even its author admitted its tendentious purpose. Carney also claims the knowledge and wisdom of Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg. The power of Greta Thunberg's message lies in the way she drives home both the cold logic of climate physics and the fundamental unfairness of the climate crisis. Anybody who cites an anxious 17-year-old as an authority on climate science and moral philosophy should be an object of deep suspicion. But then, according to Carney, climate science is easy. Greta's basic calculations are ones that she should easily master and powerfully project. Carney says he once gave Greta a tour of the Bank of England's gold vaults. One wonders if she also offered up tips on monetary policy. But then, in early 2020, Greta demonstrated her complete disconnect from reality when at the WEF in Davos, she called for an immediate cessation of emissions, which would tank the world economy and potentially kill millions. Even Carney admits her deviating from her wisdom on that point. Far from demonstrating a firm knowledge of the climate system itself, Carney cites scary but misleading statistics. Since the 1980s, he writes, the number of registered weather-related loss events have tripled, and the inflation-adjusted losses have increased fivefold. Consistent with the accelerated pace of climate change, the cost of weather-related insurance losses has increased eightfold in real terms over the past decade to an annual average of $60 billion. I asked Professor Roger Pilka, Jr., an expert on climate and economics at the University of Colorado, to comment. He replied, Carney has confused economics with weather. The increase in losses he describes is well understood to occur for two main reasons: more wealth and property exposed to loss and better accounting of those losses. To assess trends in extreme weather, must one look at weather data, not at economic loss data. Among Carney's current responsibilities since leaving the Bank of England as its governor is advising Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Carney's confusion is hardly innocent, since his agenda depends on incessantly warming what had been biblical is becoming commonplace. In other words, what was once sacred has now collapsed into the profane. Fortunately, Carney has been making claims about worsening weather for long enough that we can assess some of his predictions. In his recent book, Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters, Stephen Koonin, former Undersecretary for Science at the Obama-era U.S. Energy Department, cites the speech Carney made to Lloyd's of London before the Paris Climate Conference of 2015. The speech was designed to frighten the insurance industry into divestment from fossil fuels. On that basis, that many oil and gas reserves would be stranded as we exhaust our allowable carbon budget. Carney pointed out that the previous UK winter had been the wettest since the time of King George III. He went on to say, forecasts suggest we can expect at least a further 10% increase in rainfall during future winters. For support, he cited the UK Met's office forecast for the next 5 years. Turned out to be dead wrong. The 6 winters after 2014 averaged 39% less rainfall than the 2014 record. Meanwhile, a Met Office report in 2018 acknowledged that the largest source of variability in UK extreme rainfalls during the winter months was the North Atlantic oscillation mode of natural variability, not climate change. It's surprising, notes Koonin, that someone with a PhD in economics and experience with the unpredictability of financial markets and economies as a whole doesn't show a greater respect for the perils of prediction and more caution in depending upon models. During his BBC Rife lectures last year on the topic of how we get what we value, Carney received a few challenges from his hand-picked questioners, but a couple came from eminent historian Neil Ferguson. Ferguson asked Carney why, in his discussion of the climate issues, he made no reference to Bjorn Lomborg, a much more knowledgeable Scandinavian than Greta, and in particular to Lomborg's book, False Alarm, in which Lomborg establishes, using official science, that there is no existential climate crisis, that adapting to climate change is manageable, and that the kinds of policies promoted by Carney are likely to be far more costly than any impact from extreme weather. Carney, of course, hadn't read the book, but he dismissed Lomborg by saying it's 50 or 20 years ago when he first came out with his "Don't worry about the climate, how's that working out for us?" But Lomborg never said don't worry about the climate. He just suggested that we had put its risks into perspective. Meanwhile, Lomborg's non-alarmist thesis is working out much better than that of doomsdayers such as Carney. The offhand rejection of someone as widely respected as Lomborg exposes the hypocrisy of Carney's statements and values that experts need to listen to all sides. All of us, as individuals, have a responsibility to be more open and to engage respectfully different views if we want constructive political debate and to make progress on important issues. Except climate catastrophe dissenters don't make it into the debate. There can only be zero diversity of views on net zero. Ferguson put another thorny question to Carney at the Rife lecture. He pointed out that since the 2015 Paris Agreement, China had been responsible for almost half the increase in global carbon emissions, and it was building more coal capacity as in the current year than existed in the entire United States. What did China's promises of net zero by 2060 mean? Ferguson asked, if it was actually leading the pollution charge. Carney's non-response was that China is the largest manufacturer of zero-emission cars and the leading producer of renewable energy. Koonin notes in his book that Carney is probably the single most influential figure in driving investors in financial institutions around the world to focus on changes in climate and human influences upon it. So it's important to pay close attention to what he says. Mark Carney cries crocodile tears at the possible viability of the Marxist perspective in today's political environment. But if there is one sure sign of Marxism, it's a belief that capitalism is, or is about to be, in crisis. His new book has an appendix on Marx's theory of surplus value, that all profits are wrung from the hides of labor. He also cites Marx's collaborator Friedrich Engels, and particularly notes Engels' pause, the one period in capitalist history early in the 19th century when workers may not have shared the increases in productivity brought about by industrialization. Carney projects that the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a phenomenon much invoked by the WEF, might bring about a similar period, thus providing a source of political unrest. It could be generations before the gains of the Fourth Industrial Revolution are widely shared, he writes. In the interim, there could be long periods of technological unemployment, sharply rising inequalities, and intensely social unrest. If the world of surplus labor comes to pass, Marx and Engels could again become relevant. He rather seems to hope so. Carney claims powerful parallels between Marx's time and our own. Substitute performance for platforms for textile mills, machine learning for the steam engine, and Twitter for the telegraph, and current dynamics echo those of that era. Then Karl Marx was scribbling the Communist Manifesto in the reading rooms of the British Library. Today, radical viral blogs and tweets voice similar outrage. In fact, Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto based on a tract by Engels in Brussels, not at the British Library. But it's more important to remember where Marx's misguided and immutable outrage led to a disastrous economic and political model that generated poverty and mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Meanwhile, outrage is surely a dubious basis for policy. The outraged are certainly a useful constituency for those seeking power. However, what brings us to the influence on Carney of the man who first tried to put Marxism into practice. When it comes to the COVID crisis, writes Carney, we are living Lenin's observation that there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. Strange that Carney would cite one of the most ruthless murderers in history for this rather bland insight. But then Carney's agenda is not without its own parallels to Lenin, minus, one presumes, the precondition of rampant bloodshed. Although Vladimir Lenin did not know much about business or economics, he declared that communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. Carney's plan is global. We need, he claims, to electrify everything and turn electricity generation green. The problem is that wind and solar power electricity needs both hefty government subsidies and fossil fuel backup for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Green electricity is inflexible, expensive, and disruptive to grids. Carney cites Joseph Schumpeter's concept of creative destruction, but his own version involves not the metaphorical and benign process of market innovation making old technologies redundant, but a deliberate suppression of viable technologies to make way for less reliable and less economic alternatives. When Lenin wrecked the Russian economy after brutally seizing power in 1917, he was forced to backtrack and allow some private enterprise to prevent people from starving. However, he assured his radical comrades that he would retain control of the commanding heights of heavy industry. Carney's plan is to control the global economy by seizing the commanding heights of finance, not by nationalization, but by exerting non-democratic pressure to divest from and stop funding fossil fuels. The private sector is to become a partner in imposing its own bondage. This will be do-it-yourself totalitarianism. Indeed, companies in our one-party ESG state are already pleading like show trial defendants, making suicidal net zero commitments, lest banks cut them off. To further that end, Carney has helped start a key organization, the Network for Greening the Financial System, a collection of central bankers and regulators. He has also signed up ever-growing constituency of activist policy wonks who peddle emissions measurement and certification, eco-audits, and ESG rankings. This agenda is inevitably appealing to the transnational organizations such as the International Energy Agency. I could go on and on and on. It's just one diatribe in Marxism. I invite you to read the article for yourself. I've read too much of it now, I suppose, for most of you. I've definitely read too much of it for me. But I will end by this. I oppose everything that Carney stands for. But what about you? Opposition to tyranny has become a greater public duty and a more significant Christian imperative than ever before. God help us if that man continues to dominate our economy.